Part 69. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Gongzi. Chapter 681. 2 days later, outside Xiangyang. After Xiangyang was captured, more than 100,000 soldiers entered the pass, and the government soldiers occupied various fortresses and garrisoned. The Ziliang army took advantage of the victory and continued to set out for Jingmen, 200 miles away. After passing Xiangyang, the terrain became narrow and long, with more mountains and rivers. Tens of thousands of soldiers were stationed near Jinyu Mountain. As the imperial court's transfer order came, the atmosphere in the central army tent became extremely depressing. Candles were lit in the huge army tent, and more than 30 generals sat in it. Su Buling, dressed in a white robe, sat on the side of the armchair, holding a teacup in his hand. Next to him were more than a dozen Ziliang army generals, including Yang Zunyi, Tu Qinchu, Yu Zhuolu, Yang Guanyu, Su Ying, etc. Guan Hongyi was still the commander-in-chief, still sitting in the main seat. The various emotions on his face in the past few days were gone, and he was very calm, not caring about everyone's eyes at all. The generals of the imperial court were hovering around Su Buling and Guan Hongyi, being so cautious that they dared not even breathe. Guan Hongyi placed the imperial edict in his hand on the table and glanced at the generals. The emperor has ordered that Su Buling has made great contributions, but he is still young and it is not appropriate for him to take charge of the army rashly. He should take the palace soldiers back to Nanyang to garrison. In addition, the left prince of northern Qi has been making frequent moves recently. In order to prevent Ziliang from being lost, Tu Qinchu and Yang Zunyi will take 30,000 Ziliang infantrymen back to defend Ziliang and leave immediately. This edict, which was just sent from the holy Chang'an city, basically only had 4 big words written on it: "Get out of here." When Guan Hongyi received it, he was shocked. He didn't understand how such an imperial edict was written, but he was relieved in the end. On the night when the victory report was sent back, a fire suddenly broke out in the imperial city, burning down the Lichhan Hall. It was said to be the work of an assassin. Afterwards, the city of Chang'an was put under martial law. The imperial guards and wolf guards directly sealed off Kuishao Street and stood at the doors of various princes and generals to guard the safety of the civil and military officials in the court. At the court meeting the next day, Songji was frightened by the assassination, and the emperor was furious. 2 ministers were beaten with 50 sticks for being late, and 1 was killed on the spot. Then they began to talk about political affairs. When this imperial edict was issued, all the civil and military officials had objections, saying that Prince Zhou could not be ready to make a move, and Su Buling had military merits. Even Kui Huelu felt that it was a bit too much. But Songji ignored it, saying that it was inappropriate for Su Buling to lead troops at a young age. The detectives of the investigation department received a secret report that Prince Zhou was preparing to attack Ziliang. He even took out the black materials of some court officials who opposed more fiercely in the past and stripped them of their official robes on the spot. The investigation department monitored the civil and military officials in the court, and no one had a clean foundation. In the end, the court officials did not speak, but just watched Songji act arbitrarily on the dragon throne. How inexplicable and unreasonable this imperial edict was can be seen from the reactions of the generals at all levels of the Ziliang army. Yang Zunyi's eyes were stunned, Tu Qinchu's face was furious, and the young general behind him stood up directly with his sword pressed. Su Buling sat on the armchair with a teacup in his hand, glanced at the imperial edict and said, "Are you kidding me? All the generals of Ziliang and even the generals of the court thought so." Su Buling led 2,000 people to fight Nanyang and 20,000 people to fight Xiangyang. He charged in front every time. The territory recovered now can be said to have been conquered by Su Buling alone. The battle has not yet ended, and he has made such a military achievement. It doesn't matter if the court does not praise him. Instead, it directly allows Su Buling to return to Nanyang to continue his retirement, and even lets the 30,000 infantrymen who came all the way here go back to where they came from. Isn't this just a joke? Guan Hongyi sat on the commander's seat and looked directly at Su Buling. His eyes were not afraid at all, but rather calm. This is the emperor's intention. If you are not satisfied, you can go to the emperor to argue. Su Buling put down the teacup, took the imperial edict and unfolded it to glance at it. My soldiers of the Ziliang army walked 3,000 miles to Xiangyang, conquered cities and won battles, and did not fail in any way. The court doesn't reward them, but I can agree to let them return the same way with such a lame excuse. Do you think your soldiers can agree? Guan Hongyi said coldly, if the prince doesn't want to leave, he can continue to fight, but disobeying the imperial edict will be treated as treason. I have the responsibility to prevent Guangzhou from being lost, so I can only mobilize troops against the Ziliang army. General. You can't. Many generals in the court were shocked and stood up to stop them. The generals of Ziliang were furious and cursed. You are worthy. With only 100,000 soldiers outside, you want to use knives against my 50,000 Ziliang army. There was constant noise in the military tent, but Guan Hongyi was unmoved, just raised his neck. If your highness does not obey the emperor, you can take my head, turn around and fight Guangzhou Road, and ask the emperor for an explanation. As soon as these words came out, the noisy military tent quieted down again. The Ziliang generals were obviously stunned. They did not expect Guan Hongyi to be a rogue. But now it is indeed the case. This aggressive imperial edict has been issued. If the Ziliang army does not accept the order, Guan Hongyi will lead his troops to fight the Ziliang army. No matter whether they can win or not, the Ziliang army will fight back and it will be a rebellion. If they are not convinced and kill Guan Hongyi, it will also be a rebellion. Anyway, the meaning of the imperial edict is that you either get out or rebel, and it is useless to say anything. The Ziliang army would definitely not tolerate this, but can the Ziliang army rebel now? The Ziliang generals thought about it and realized that the matter was too big and they definitely could not make the decision. They all looked at Su Buling. Su Buling had only two choices. Now he could either kill Guan Hongyi with a single blow, or take the Ziliang army and some palace soldiers to attack Guangzhou Road. Guangzhou Road could be taken down, it could be taken down before, and it can be taken down now. But what to do after taking it down? Only the Su family rebels and encircles Guangzhou. The Guangzhou army in northern Xinjiang will definitely give up the defense north of the Yellow River, and the Liaxi army will join the Four Kings to support the new king. Even if the king of Shu does not have enough to eat, he will definitely force his men to go to King Qin of Shu. Prince Zhou of the northern Qi dynasty would also take the back route. In an instant, he was surrounded by enemies on all sides and was isolated. He would lose the morale of the army and the people by killing the king and usurping the throne. He would be infamous for being rebellious officials and traitors who took advantage of the situation, and he would not even have the reputation of being a military commander. The Su family was able to hold Guangzhou Road with more than 200,000 men and artillery, but it was clear that the gains outweighed the losses. Su Buling looked at Guan Hongyi for a moment, then finally smiled, stood up and picked up the imperial edict. They are all General Dayu. Why would General Guan say such hurtful words? There was a fire in the palace and the Holy One was frightened. This imperial edict may have been issued hastily. I will write to the court and beg the Holy One to take back the order and make a new decision. Ziliang Army 3. The 10,000 soldiers are on standby in Xiangyang for the time being, and General Guan can continue to lead the troops to attack Jingmen. If the Holy One insists on sending the Ziliang army back to defend Ziliang, I will take the order. Many court generals breathed a sigh of relief and looked at Guan Hongyi. Guan Hongyi's expression did not change. He raised his hand and said, "The Holy One has an order. In order to prevent losses in Ziliang, 30,000 infantry will immediately leave Xiangyang and return to defend Ziliang. I hope His Highness the Prince will think twice before making any move and don't let me use weapons against Pao Zi. Not giving an inch. There was a noise in the military tent. Many imperial generals tried to dissuade them, and the Ziliang army generals were furious. Su Buling said nothing, took the imperial edict and turned around and left the commander's tent. Walk. Yang Zunyi and Tu Qianchu didn't say anything more, and left the commander's tent with the general. After Su Buling and others left, the deputy general stepped forward with a pale face and said anxiously, "General, you can't do it? If Su Buling goes out and leads his troops to attack the camp, the soldiers under his command might turn against him on the spot. Not to mention the soldiers under his command, many court generals in the military tents have the intention of defecting. After all, if there is a fight now, they will definitely be crushed to death by the Ziliang army." But Guan Hongyi had already waited for Songji's secret order, and he didn't give in at all. Let the three armies prepare for war, and promise not to withdraw from Xiangyang before dawn. The Ziliang army will be punished for resisting the decree and treason. This. Useless. Go quickly. After coming out of the commander's tent, Su Buling took the generals back to the Ziliang army camp. Military advisor Yu Julu walked in front of him, his brows furrowed. The emperor is getting impatient and has adopted a desperate posture. Xiangyang has just been captured, and the government soldiers have not had time to gather them. Now is not the time to rebel. It is not advisable to attack the key point rashly and affect the whole body with one move. Su Buling naturally knew that this was not advisable, waved his hand and said, "General Yang, you lead people to appease the soldiers, then break up the camp and evacuate Xiangyang, just leave slowly. Songji is just anxious. Xiaoqi has arrangements over there. I will go and talk to the emperor in a few days. Also, my Su family is full of loyal people, don't talk about rebellion all the time." All the generals in Ziliang were speechless and said to themselves, "Little prince, you are calling the emperor by his name every time you say Songji, and you still have a whole family of loyalties?" However, these words can only be said in the heart. After all, the Su family is still a minister of Daewoo. If you don't object, you can't talk nonsense. They all nodded and returned to the camp. Ning Qingyi wore light armor and was working as a soldier outside from beginning to end, and never spoke. After his generals left, Su Buling slowed down, walked side by side with Ning Qingyi, and secretly held Ning Qingyi's little hand. Ning Qingyi quickly pulled away, breathing up and down, but made no other expression. It was the same before. Su Buling naturally didn't mind, and held Ning Qingyi's little hand again and wouldn't let go. It's just a couple holding hands, what's there to hide? Ning Qingyi's eyelashes trembled slightly, and after a few twitches, she stopped struggling and turned her head to look to the other side, so calmly. "I just heard that the court won't let you fight. Are you still going to fight?" Su Buling smiled, "We won't be fighting for a while. We have to deal with the matters in Chang'an City first. Are you tired from running around these days? Take a good rest." Ning Qingyi did not respond. After arriving at the door of the handsome tent, he withdrew his hand and turned towards his own tent. "I'm tired. I'll ask master to change my shift. You can rest early." Su Buling figured it out, today seemed to be the day to paint the palace sand for Dabai, so he didn't hold back and said with a smile, "Go to bed early." After watching Ning Qingyi leave, Su Buling entered the tent. Little Nightingale was sitting behind the desk, reading a letter. Seeing Su Buling coming back, she stood up and handed the letter to Su Buling. "Sir, Sister Kikai has learned the news and everything has been arranged. To prevent anything from happening, you have to go back secretly." "Yeah." Su Buling took the letter, glanced at it carefully, curled his lips, put it away and put it in his arms. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 682. The moonlight is quiet and scattered between the mountains and fields. Outside the mountains, military tents are connected in a row, and torches are like lamps and sponges extending to the horizon. In the small woods of Jinyu Mountain, men and women walk deeper, looking for a suitable place in the dense woods, and their conversations are faintly heard. The woods are not good, there are too many mosquitoes, they always bite me instead of you. Master Bai. What Bai? It's obviously you who are thick-skinned. It would be great if there was a pool of water, you wouldn't be afraid of mosquito bites in the water, and you don't have to wash up afterwards. Since Ning Yu finished drawing the Shaogongsha on Dongting Lake last year, he had to redraw it every 7 days, and most of the time it was Su Buling who did the drawing. In that kind of place, Su Buling couldn't stand just drawing the Shaogongsha, so it would be natural for him to do something else later. In order to prevent Manzi and King Yi from finding out, Ning Yu certainly didn't dare to stay in the house with Su Buling. She usually found a small forest or something. In the past year, she spent more time in the wild than in the house, and she had gained experience in sleeping. At this time, under the moonlight, Ning Yu washed herself clean, held a small blanket in her arms, and held the magnolia cream and whitetail in her hands, and walked slowly with Su Buling. Su Buling could only eat white steamed buns once every 7 days, so he was naturally very greedy. After walking a few steps and seeing that there was no one around, he hugged Ning Yu's waist and moved restlessly. Ning Yu's quiet cheeks showed a few blushes, and she gently bumped Su Buling with her shoulder. "Don't worry, Master hasn't found a place yet." Su Buling was a little helpless, so he had to stop and climb the mountain together honestly. After searching for a while, he finally found a flat stone ground in the wilderness. Ning Yu walked up to him and looked around, then threw the blanket in her arms on the ground, sat on it sideways, slowly untied the thin rope of the light armor, then pulled up her skirt, supported her back with her hands, bit her lower lip, etc. Su Buling sat down in front of him, took out a small porcelain box and a paintbrush with paint, dipped it a few times, leaned forward, and carefully outlined the lines on the already faded flying phoenix wings. Ning Yu was obviously a little bit overwhelmed by the faint breath blowing on the barren skin. Even though she had experienced it many times, she still felt it was strange and found some topics casually. "You said you were going back. When will you come? How about I follow you?" Su Buling sketched carefully, licked his lips from time to time, and smiled when he heard it. "I guess I have to go to Chang'an City again. I can't say when I will be back." Ning Yu's face gradually turned red, and she was very mature and charming under the moonlight. "Then, what should I do about this? I've been away for too long. If King Yi finds out. If I haven't come back in a few days, you can take King Yi back to the boat and wait for me. Let the baby help you draw." "Ah." Ning Yu was a little entangled when he heard this. Let Su Buling draw. There is nothing awkward for a long time, but it is completely different when Xiang'er starts to write. Xiao Xiang'er is also a girl. She is particularly curious about Ning Yu. While drawing, she asks something, "Dabai, does Su Buling like to nibble on you?" and other words. Ning Yu couldn't stand it. However, apart from Su Buling, only Xiang'er had this skill, so Ning Yu had no choice but to nod. After drawing many times, Su Buling was already very skilled. In just a few strokes, the Shaogongsha was perfectly formed. Next. Wu. Ning Yu was dragged down by the ankle and lay on the blanket, and then her knees were pressed on her shoulders. She hesitated a little. "Don't be impatient, before she finished the 2 sentences, she bit her fingers and accepted it. The night was quiet and silent. Men and women played in the forest. Although it was summer, the spring scenery was seductive. Sometimes even the full moon in the sky was shy and hid behind the clouds. However, this scene that made others envious was like falling into the cold winter of December in the eyes of some people. At the top of the mountain next to her, Ning King Yi, wearing a straw raincoat, held a telescope borrowed from Nightingale and looked at the two figures on the opposite hillside. For a month or so, Ning Qingyi had figured out the pattern and knew that every 7 days, her master would draw the toad sand. So she changed shifts early today and went back to the tent, fell asleep, so that her master could look for Su Buling with a legitimate reason, and then she ran out. As expected, her master and Su Buling were no longer in the general's tent. Nightingale said that they were out for inspection, so she borrowed a telescope to look at the stars. There were no towns around the military camp, and Ning Qingyi didn't believe that the two would run too far. They must be nearby, so she came to the top of the mountain on the side and carefully searched with the telescope. Finally, she found two figures in the woods of Jinyu Mountain, appearing and disappearing, and finally stopped on a stone. The two people lay together. Ning Qingyi knew that they were drawing the toad sand, but she never expected that after the two people finished drawing, they would actually have sex in this uninhabited mountain. How could the master become like this? Ning Qingyi was tense, holding up a monocular, looking at the familiar figure in the distance, her eyes full of disbelief. At first, she had some doubts in her heart, thinking there was something else going on. The master had a gentle personality, and Su Buling was skilled in martial arts and had a smooth tongue. It was possible that Su Buling had forced the master without telling her, forcing the master to do these things that he would never have done before. But, although it was hard to see clearly under the moonlight, the indescribable postures could be seen, even committing a crime of subjugation, pressing Su Buling down. Ning Qingyi felt that her worldview was shattered. This person didn't look like her gentle master. He looked worse than Zhongli Jiju. Last time I bumped into Zhongli Jiju and Su Buling together, Zhongli Jiju was obviously very shy, but now the master took the initiative to shock her. This is just like a Purta who has not touched a man for more than 10 years. Like a resentful woman. And it seems to have a tail? Ning Qingyi put down the telescope, tilted her head and couldn't stand it anymore. She felt cold all over. She wanted to say something serious, but she couldn't say it in front of the master who raised her. Pervert, bastard. Ning Qingyi stood there for a moment, her eyes gradually becoming mist-filled, but she just murmured a few words in a low voice and then stopped. In any case, master is very happy now. It is obviously not forced, and it seems that he even wants to be a guest. As long as the master is voluntary, what can she say as a disciple? I have already said that no matter who master likes, she will support him. People in the world of Jianghu can't keep track of their words, nor can they forget their upbringing, so what else can they say? But, that bastard. Ning Qingyi clutched the telescope tightly, thinking of the kiss in Chang'an City, the hand-in-hand in Suzhou, and even the whisper in Fangshan County. Ning Qingyi has an outspoken temperament and doesn't know how to beat around the bush when thinking about things, but she also has a clear distinction between love and hate. Anyone who treats her well will be repaid several times in return. The master was obviously very good to her, and Su Buling was almost meticulous to her, so no matter what he did, she wouldn't mind, and she couldn't mind. In fact, after seeing the scene with her own eyes, Ning Qingyi's heart was not as disturbed as Chu Chu's. The ups and downs in her heart now, compared to the shock and anger, actually come more from embarrassment, and the embarrassment of not knowing how to get along with each other in the future. Thinking of all the words her master had said in the past, Ning Qingyi finally realized that her master had been greeting her all the time. With the examples of Chu Chu and Juju in front of her, Ning Qingyi also understood that what her master said was right. She and her master could not be separated or turn against each other because of this. But it is obviously impossible to accept this kind of thing for a while. Ning Qingyi is relatively slow to feelings and doesn't know how to solve it. After standing there in silence for a long time, Ning Qingyi walked down the mountain in a slightly lonely manner. Under the moonlight, one person and one sword seemed to have become the lonely people they once were when they walked thousands of miles alone. Asking for a monthly ticket. The debt repayment serial number was written incorrectly. It is 259,583. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Zi. Chapter 683. After 3 o'clock, the infantry of the Ziliang army broke out of camp one after another, and headed for Guanzhong Road under the leadership of Yang Zunyi. Su Buling and Ning Yuhe returned to the military camp together. Since they had something to do tomorrow, they went back to their tents to rest. After working so hard in Jinyu Mountain for a long time, even Ning Yuhe's body, which was highly skilled in martial arts, was about to fall apart. It was sore and numb, and he felt like he was floating when he walked. Passing by the camp where Master Zhongli and his disciples were, Ning Yuhe listened attentively. The two of them were still awake and were talking quietly. Chu, I didn't run away secretly, I just got up and drank some water. What water do you want to drink? As soon as I closed my eyes, you secretly climbed up. You got up 3 times to drink water. I'm thirsty. Is your mouth a place you're thirsty for? You treated Su Buling after he broke into Xiangyang the day before yesterday, and you've already done something with him. It's only been 2 days, and you're going to torment him again. You're a medical student, and 1 drop of semen and 10 drops of blood, don't you understand? Now you are marching and fighting, and you have broken Su Buling's body. If something goes wrong on the battlefield, do you think the lady will kick you out? Oh Chu, I really just got up to drink water. It's hot and I'm thirsty, right Yi? Twitter. Do you have today too? A trace of schadenfreude flashed in Ning Yuhe's eyes, and he secretly ridiculed Jeju for Shigang's lack of enthusiasm before returning to his tent with satisfaction. Although he pretended to be a personal soldier, Ning Yuhe was Su Buling's master after all, and the tent he lived in was not simple. The night is already deep, but the oil lamp in the tent has not been extinguished. Outside, you can see a silhouette sitting cross-legged at a table, sitting upright and motionless. Ning Yuhe paused. King Yi had already fallen asleep when she left, so why did she get up again? She hesitated for a moment, lowered her head and checked carefully to make sure there was nothing revealing, then she opened the door curtain with a smile and entered. In the camp, Ning Qingyi sat alone in front of a small table. There was a snow-white sword and a package on the table. She was still wearing the armor of a soldier without a helmet. Her long hair was draped on her back. Her cold and charming appearance was reflected in the light. Even more beautiful, but without any expression, as deserted as ever. Ning Yuhe's smiling expression froze, and he felt something was wrong. He rolled his eyes, walked slowly to the front, and said softly, King Yi, why are you up? What are you packing for? Ning Qingyi raised her eyes and looked at the familiar gentle face. At this moment, Ning Qingyi still couldn't connect the affectionate cheek in front of her with the big white strip hanging on Su Buling's neck that moved on its own. But no matter what happened to the woman in front of her, these concerned eyes were not fake. They were the only thing Ning Qingyi clung to in the world after losing her mother. As long as those eyes don't change, he will always be his master, no matter what happens. Ning Qingyi was silent for a moment, and finally curled up her lips and said softly, Master, Man Zi must be bored on the ship. I ask Su Buling that we won't fight again in the short term. I'm a little tired these days, so I won't continue with you and go back to the ship for a while. Oh. Ning Yuhe nodded slightly. During the past few days when they were attacking the city, King Yi and Su Buling had been fighting everywhere together and put in a lot of effort. It was natural to be tired, but the sudden return to the ship was obviously too abrupt. Ning Yuhe looked carefully, but Ning Qingyi lowered her head and poured water on her own without looking at her. Ning Yuhi hesitated for a moment and smiled softly. I'm a little tired these days. It would be good to go back and rest with Manzi for a while. Well, I just packed up my things and went back suddenly. It was a bit too urgent. Do you have anything else to do? Ning Qingyi shook her head. I've always been like this, and it's not like Master doesn't know. Since we won't be fighting for the time being, it's good to travel while the night is cool. There's a lot of war and chaos outside. Su Buling seems to be going back in a few days. Otherwise, let him send you off. I won't run around. General Yang Zunyi and his infantry will break camp and return tonight. They have to pass through Nanyang. I will go back with the Ziliang army. Ning Yuhi thought about it, but it was a bit too sudden to leave like this. She thought for a while. Go to sleep first. Say hello to Su Buling tomorrow morning before leaving. If you ride fast, it will only take an hour to catch up with the infantry. Ning Qingyi shook his head. He has been tired for a day and should rest. It's not a separation between life and death. Master can just tell him tomorrow morning. I'll leave first. After Ning Qingyi finished speaking, he picked up the military helmet and put it on his head. He carried the small package and walked out. When passing by Ning Yuhi, he whispered. Master, there's no need to send him off. You've been tired for half the night, so take a good rest. Ning Yuhi's movements when he stood up froze for a moment, and he was a little unsure, and whispered. I just stood on the post for a long time, and I patrolled around with your child. I'm not tired, eh? Before he finished speaking, Ning Qingyi had already left the tent and followed the Ziliang infantry who set off overnight. Although Ning Yuhi didn't notice anything strange, he and Ning Qingyi had been dependent on each other for many years. He could clearly feel that something was wrong. His heart was in his throat, but he didn't dare to ask questions. She followed carefully out of the tent and watched the lonely Ning Qingyi merge into the Ziliang infantry team. She wanted to speak several times, but she didn't dare. Could it be that Qingye just discovered something? When Ning Yuhi thought of this, she felt cold sweat coming out. She ran back to the tent and looked around. She didn't find any clues in the tent. But she still felt that something must have happened. She didn't know how much Qingye guessed. After thinking for a while, she ran out of the tent and went to Su Buling to discuss it. Ning Yuhi was in a state of confusion. Just after taking a few steps in the military camp, she saw a woman in a skirt on the path leading to the general's tent. She was carefully avoiding the sight of the patrolling soldiers and approaching Su Buling's tent. Ning Yuhi's eyes lit up slightly, and she came to the front and pressed the woman's shoulder. Zhongli Jiju was holding her breath and concentrating her energy while sneaking, when someone suddenly patted her shoulder. She shivered with fear and said in a hurry. Chu, I just came out to relieve myself. No. Ning Yuhi? You stinky nun, you don't sleep in the middle of the night and run out to scare people. Ning Yuhi's eyes turned cold, and she pulled Zhongli Jiju into a dark place and said coldly. Don't talk nonsense, I have something to find you. Zhongli Jiju had gone through so much trouble to coax Chu to sleep, and she didn't even get to see her husband, but she was stopped by her mortal enemy. How could she bear it? She glared with her beautiful eyes. Can't you say it in the daytime? You just had sex with Su Buling, and I came to take a look, and you ran out to block the way. How can you protect your food like this? What do you mean by protecting your food? Ning Yuhi pulled Zhongli Jiju, who wanted to leave, frowned, and said, You stupid woman, I helped you coax Chu, you know that I didn't repay the favor, otherwise I will tell Chu that you deliberately stole her man. Hey! Zhongli Jiju glared, and wanted to argue a little, but was afraid of disturbing Chu, so she could only frown and said, If you have something to say it quickly. What? Were you caught by Qingye having sex in the wild? Oh my, you also have a day god. Pa. Ning Yuhi raised her hand and pinched the gloating Zhongli Jiju's waist, and said coldly. We are all grasshoppers in the same bed, let's not laugh at each other. I feel that things can't be concealed recently. King Yi may have guessed something. You have to play with me. Ning Yuhi asked her for something, so Zhongli Jiju's momentum naturally rose. She hugged her chest and raised her chin. Call me sister. Ning Yuhi's eyes condensed, and turned her head and said, Choo choo. Hey 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 hee hee, I'm kidding. Zhongli Jiju was startled and quickly raised her hand to cover Ning Yuhi's mouth. Ning Yuhi opened his hands and said in a deep voice, I will find an opportunity in a few days. I will deliberately let King Yi discover the affair between Su Buling and me. Then I will be ashamed and want to die. You should run out quickly and say that everything is your fault. You drugged me. You should die. Why? Zhongli Jiju stood up straighter and shook his head seriously. I'm not asking you to die. I'm just pretending. King Yi knows right from wrong and will definitely drag you along. No, if I say that, how will Chuchu look at me? You drugged me in the first place, and I didn't ask you to lie. As for Chuchu, I'll just let Chuchu stay away from the scene when the time comes. The two masters gathered together and whispered about various things. Before they could finish discussing, Su Buling, who had noticed something, came out of the general's tent wearing a robe and came to them with a puzzled look. Master, Jiju, what are you doing? Ning Yuhi remembered the business, stopped talking, and ran to Su Buling. Ling King Yi said he was a little tired and wanted to go back to the boat to accompany Manzi. He has already left with the infantry. I think he left too hastily. I think he has something to do. You are going back, so why don't you follow him and take a look? King Yi is going back to the boat. Yes. Just now I just left, I guess I haven't left Xiangyang yet. Su Buling frowned slightly, thought for a moment, and said, Jiju, let little sparrow go first, I'll pack some things. Zhongli Jiju only then realized that Su Buling was leaving, and asked in confusion, why go back? No more fighting? Then why don't we go back together? You stay in the barracks for a few days, everything is the same, just as if I'm still in the general's tent. Nightingale will take care of other things. Oh. The two seemed to understand, but nodded anyway. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 684. The plain stretches as far as the eye can see, and the silver moon illuminates black shadows that march in an orderly manner on the earth. After many days of fighting, the infantrymen of Ziliang were filled with the smell of blood. Just when the situation was at a breaking point, they were suddenly notified by the court to withdraw their troops. For professional soldiers who relied on their military exploits, this was not a situation where they could go home to their wives and children. Good news, however, Ziliang's military order prohibited it, but no one complained. They just followed the two generals Yang Zunyi and Tu Qinchu and marched silently. At the front of the team, a group of white wind-chasing horses maintained a distance of more than a mile and moved slowly towards Nanyang. The infantry marched very slowly, and the horse chasing the wind could only be regarded as a walk. After walking a certain distance, it had to stop and wait. Ning King Yi, who was wearing light armor, took off his helmet and hung it on the side of the horse. 3,000 black hairs were fluttering gently in the night wind. The tall horse matched with the tall figure. Against the backdrop of the silver moon and the vast plains, the scene was surprisingly beautiful. If Su Danking were here, I'm afraid he would think that Ning Qingyi had painted the painting by the sea too early. Just like the last time she sat alone on a big tree by the sea and looked at the sea, Ning Qingyi was looking at the endless plains, thinking about the same person with the same confusion. Ning Qingyi tried to think about where to go in the future, but she grew up in the mountains and the only person around her was her master. She never thought about being separated from her master, but she couldn't accept the current change, so she was left at a loss. A man and a horse were walking not far in the wilderness when the sound of flapping wings sounded above their heads. Ninkingyi raised her eyes and saw that the little sparrow staggered down and landed directly on the big head of the white wind-chasing horse, and then lay down directly. Apparently it was woken up in the middle of the night and flew away again. It's very tiring to come so far to look for someone. Ninkingyi glanced twice, took off the water bag from her side, poured some water into her hand, and then stretched out her hand flatly. The little sparrow flapped its little wings and jumped onto Ninkingyi's wrist, nodding and pecking at it. "Why are you here? Master asked you to come." Twitter. The little sparrow drank 2 mouthfuls of water, then turned around, raised its little head, and called twice seriously. Ninkingyi obviously couldn't understand the birdsong. He didn't have much contact with the little sparrows and couldn't understand the meaning. He shook his head and smiled, then ignored it. He put the little sparrow on his shoulders and squatted down, and continued walking towards Nanyang. The little sparrow was very smart and noticed Ninkingyi's mood. It became similar to that of Choo Choo when she was broken up in love. She chirped twice more, then she came close to her neck and rubbed her furry head against her. Ninkingyi kept silent and forced herself. After being rubbed a few times, she felt a little itchy, so she turned her head slightly and rubbed the little sparrow twice. One person and one bird just moved forward aimlessly. With some comfort, Ninkingyi stopped thinking about those troublesome things. Unfortunately, before he could suppress the confusion in his heart, the horse's hoof came from behind. Tap tap tap. The horseshoes and the ringing bells are clear and familiar in the night. Ninkingyi stiffened slightly and did not look back. She instinctively pinched the horse's belly, trying to run away quickly. After taking just a few steps, he regained his composure, slowed down his horse, and continued walking leisurely. The little sparrow turned on its shoulder and looked at the plain behind. Black wind-chasing horses galloped across the plains, with swords and spears hanging on their sides. Su Buring put on a black robe and a cloak. He couldn't see his face while galloping at night. From the side of the team, "Spare me." Soon, Su Buling came to Ninkingyi's side, reined in the reins and walked side by side. "King Yi, why did you leave suddenly?" He still had the bright smile of the past, handsome yet heroic, and with a bit of otherworldly tranquility. It's just that Ninkingyi had just seen Su Buling's bestiality and indulgence on her gentle and considerate master. How could she be touched by this friendly face again? She just looked ahead and said calmly, "I miss Manzi so much. I want to go back and live for a while. You don't need to see me off. I'm not a child. I know the way." Su Buling got a little closer, took the reins of Ninkingyi's horse, and ran forward faster. "I also want to go back and take a look. We just want to go together." When Ninkingyi heard this, she narrowed her eyes slightly and raised her hand to rein in her horse and turn. "Forget it, I won't go back. Choo Choo is bored staying alone in the military camp." "You can go back alone?" Su Buling was a little confused. Even with his hard head, he could understand that Ninkingyi was avoiding him. He looked at Ninkingyi for a few times, thought about it, and suddenly flew up and sat behind Ninkingyi. "King Yi, what's wrong?" Ninkingyi stiffened suddenly and squeezed with her shoulder. "You go down." Su Buletinling naturally refused to go down. He raised his arms and put his arms around Ninkingyi's waist. Although he was wearing armor and felt like he was holding an iron lump, he still hugged her very gently and said with a smile, "Why are you suddenly angry? Did I do something wrong?" Ninkingyi's breathing gradually became faster, she gripped the reins tightly, and squeezed twice with her shoulders. Instead of pushing Su Buling away, she squeezed out tears from her own eyes. Ninkingyi's eyes were red. After holding it in for a long time, she still couldn't hold it back and said sternly, "Get out of here." The voice was a little hoarse, hiding a lot of grievance and anger. The little sparrow trembled with fright and quickly jumped on the head of the big black horse next door. The big black horse also turned its head, seeming a little confused as to why the two masters were quarreling. Su Buletinling's smile froze. When he returned to the military tent, he heard Nightingale talk about Ningqingyi borrowing a telescope to look at the stars. He didn't take it to heart at the time, but now that he thinks about it, he may have figured out something. Well. Su Buling still held Ningqingyi's waist and smiled, "Don't be angry, just listen to my explanation." "What do you explain?" As soon as he said the sentence, the emotions that had been accumulated for many days could no longer be suppressed. They rushed into his heart, almost making Ningqingyi hysterical. Ningqingyi turned around, tears welling up in her eyes still maintaining a cold edge. "What's your explanation? You're just a bastard and a pervert. How could you do this? How could you do this?" She is my master." Ningqingyi could no longer suppress it, jumped off the horse angrily, and smashed the snow-white sword in her hand at Su Buling. "She is my master. You kissed me, you said you like me, you know I like you. For you, I will not avenge myself, I will do nothing, I will follow you around aimlessly, I will follow you wherever you go, and I will do whatever you ask me to do. You think I like your palace? Do you think I've never been on a building boat? Or do you still miss this kind of luxurious life? I follow you because I like you." Ningqingyi's voice was hoarse, her shoulders were shaking uncontrollably, and she wanted to hold back tears, but her eyes showed uncontrollable sadness. Su Buling caught the sword, turned over and dismounted, smiled, and said, "I know." Ningqingyi took 2 steps back, her eyes red. "Since you know, why are you still like this? You could have rejected me. I started to dislike you. As long as you don't stalk me, I won't like you. Since you like my master, why are you still pestering me?" Su Buling stepped forward slowly. "I really like you, otherwise I wouldn't kiss you. You call this liking?" Ningqingyi pushed Su Buling hard, with anger and sadness in her eyes. "You are just lustful. You are just lustful. What do you mean you like me? If you care about me even a little bit, you would not do such a thing. You and my master have done that, and now you come here and say you like me? What do you think of me, you?" Su Buling looked embarrassed. "No, it was master who used force on me, and I was quite helpless." "You, huh?" Ningqingyi's face was filled with tears and she could no longer see clearly, and her emotions were on the verge of collapse. But when she heard these words, she was still stunned for a moment, and then she became angry. "You're talking nonsense. You." Su Buling walked up to him, raised his hands and hugged Ningqingyi tightly, and said softly, "Really, I didn't lie to you. I really like you. I didn't know that he was your master at first. He saved her once in Chang'an City, and then he became your master. Later, the master fell in love with me for some reason, and then cao in Juncheon that time when I got home, master rowed a boat to pick me up. While on the boat, she pressed me hard, I really refused to resist at that time." Ningyu was almost hysterical. He could not even maintain his strong face. He twisted his shoulders crazily and struggled. "Let me go. You're talking nonsense, master, she can't possibly." Su Buling stroked the hair on Ningqingyi's back and spoke seriously. "I swear to God, master has really done this to me, and I can't stop it. If there is even half a lie, I won't do it for the rest of my life." Ningqingyi struggled a few times, but couldn't get out of her arms and could only raise her head and glare. "You are so skilled in martial arts, how could master forcefully attack you? You are just a liar who only knows how to talk, and you are still looking for these lame excuses. Let me go. No matter how good my martial arts skills are, I can't beat master, right? There's no place to run on the boat, and master pounced on me as soon as he took off his clothes. I, sigh. Su Bulet and Ling looked at each other calmly and sighed slightly. Ning Qingyi was not good at words and was very slow in terms of emotions. Under the excitement, her mind was in a mess and she couldn't turn around at all. After a few words of questioning, she was at a loss for words. She stared at Su Buling, and after a moment, she said angrily, "Do you like master?" Su Buling nodded seriously, "Of course I like it." Ning Qingyi's eyes suddenly became sharp, "Since you like master, why do you still treat me?" "Because I kissed you first, then saved the master, and then unknowingly took care of the master. We have a skin-to-skin relationship. I, a man, have to be responsible, right? You're just horny." "Yes, I am lustful, but that doesn't stop me from liking you too." Pooh. Ning Qingyi couldn't talk anymore and didn't want to talk nonsense about such a messy matter. She squeezed out Su Buling's arm, got on her horse and ran towards the plain. Su Buling also got on the horse and followed beside him. "Qingyi." Ning Qingyi wiped her tears with her sleeves and galloped, "Shut up." "Well." Su Buling opened his mouth and had to let Ning Qingyi calm down before continuing the conversation. "Thank you to exiled Immortal ZX Boss for the reward. Currently in debt, 259/587. The Prince is very fierce." Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 685. At the mouth of the Beihe River, the boat was brightly lit, and the guards were walking back and forth on the deck, looking at the countryside where there were only empty mountains and insects chirping. Thin clouds covered the moonlight, and three figures appeared silently on the mountains like ghosts, overlooking the river mouth below. The three of them were all dressed in black. The leader was not tall, with his hands folded and his sleeves folded. His eyes were quite young under the scarf, but his eyes had a hint of worldliness. From his stance to his demeanor, he looked a bit like Eunuch. Shadow. It goes without saying that the young man's martial arts attainment can replace Eunuch's position as the death warrior. Songji would not have let Eunuch return home in old age if he had not obtained all the true inheritance from Eunuch and was a master of martial arts. On the left side of Death Soldier is Lao Yi, who has 3 straight knives across his back. He is the tallest among the 3. The 4 secret guards around Songji are all nameless. Except for A, who is the general manager of the palace, the others never show up. The last time Lao Bi appeared in public was at Wangjiang Terrace, protecting the leader. Leather mask for bait. On the Wangjiang platform, Lao Yi and Su Buling fought against each other and were defeated in 2 or 3 moves because they wanted Su Buling to successfully kill the bait set by Songji and commit the crime of regicide. He must have let him go at that time. Water can personally protect the emperor of a country. His status is only lower than Eunuch. How can he be an ordinary person? On the right side of the 2 people is Song Ying, the chief officer of the Criminal Investigation Department, who is shaking the world outside the imperial court. Song Ying is extremely talented and can compete with Zulu, the most explosive swordsman in the world, in a duel. A grandmaster level figure, but placed between A and B, there is still a slight difference. The 3 of them looked at the brightly lit building boat at the bottom of the mountain. Death Soldier A and Old B both had indifferent eyes, but Song Ying showed some hesitation. As a member of the officialdom, Song Ying was obviously not as indifferent to life and death as a dead man. After looking at it for a moment, Song Ying said, "Old Yi, this move is too risky. We are not sure whether Queen Kui is on the ship or not. If you sneak in rashly, if you are noticed." Lao Yi shook his head. "Queen Kui must die, firstly to calm the anger of the Holy One, and secondly to cover up the matter of inducing Song Yu to collude with the Lu and Han families to usurp the throne. This is what the Holy One has told her to do." Song Ying hung the sword at her waist and said in a deep voice, "As long as you make a move, there will be no end, no matter success or failure. If Su Buling and King Su know. So what if you know?" The Su family will definitely rebel. To rebel now is not to take advantage of the great righteousness. It is just to occupy Guangzhou in advance and kill the holy lineage, and use the strength of the family to fight against all the princes. It is better than wiping out the kings in the future, returning to the world, and naturally allowing the Song family to abdicate. Song Ying was a die-hard loyalist who was single-handedly promoted by Song Ji, but she also had a family and a career. Song Ying would definitely be gone without Song Ji, and she obviously did not agree with this desperate method. He wanted to say a few more words, but the dead soldier next to him raised his hand. Just do what you're told, no need to say anything. Seeing this, Song Ying could only sigh and asked again, if Su Buling comes back. Kill Su Buletinling, once and for all. Song Ying hesitated for a moment, then said nothing more and said. According to the intelligence from the spies, Xiao Qi and others are on the ship, and there are 12 guards, all of whom are top retainers maintained by Prince Su's mansion. However, Kan Yunzi and Yujulu are not here. Su Buling is still in Xiangyang and cannot make it in a short time. Come back. Keep an eye on the surroundings for a day. If Queen Kui shows up, Lao Bi and I will be responsible for containing the guards. You get on the boat and deal with Queen Kui. If you don't see Queen Kui showing up, you sneak into the boat to look for her at night. Don't alert her, I'm out there. Squat and guard to prevent Queen Kui from escaping through the waterway. After the three of them talked for a while, they dispersed and hid in the mountains and forests. Xiangyang is only 200 miles away from Nanyang, and it is a vast plain. The horse chasing the wind traveled thousands of miles in a day, and arrived near Nanyang city in the early morning. Ning Qingyi rode a white horse at a fast pace ahead. Although she never said a word, she cried all night long. After the hysterical venting, I threw away the perseverance and coldness of the past, and let the tears wet my breastplate, just like when I lost a close relative and ran away from the Sichuan village. Apart from the unstoppable tears, I could no longer think about it. Nothing happens. Su Buling followed from a distance, looking at Ning Qingyi's back. He stepped forward several times but was pushed back, so he could only follow like this. The little sparrow squatted on Su Buling's shoulder. It had already slept for a while, and then woke up again. Seeing that the two people were still sleeping, it felt a little anxious and pecked Su Buling's face twice with its beak. Chirping, he yelled twice, as if to say, "Where has your ability to bully my master gone?" very fiercely. Su Buling took out a few pine nuts and fed them a few mouthfuls before he calmed down. Unknowingly, he walked outside Nanyang city and saw the brightly lit military camp in the distance. Ning Qingyi regained consciousness slightly, raised his sleeves and wiped the corners of his eyes, preparing to ride his horse back to the building ship quickly. Su Buling speeded up his horse and came to the back. "Qingyi, wait." Ning Qingyi didn't want to talk to her at all, so she gave a light drive and was about to fly away. But as soon as she made a move, there was a heavy weight behind her, and the man she least wanted to see at this moment sat behind her again. Ning Qingyi was furious. She raised her hand and hit her behind with her elbow. Unfortunately, Su Buling, who noticed it in advance, calmed down softly. She was pulled into his arms and locked tightly. She struggled hard. "Asshole, let go, Weavua." Su Buling raised his hand to cover Ning Qingyi's mouth and said softly, "Don't be so loud. I secretly came back for important reasons, so I can't scare the snake away. Don't go back to the boat yet. Just hide with me outside for the past 2 days." Ning Qingyi couldn't believe this lame excuse, so she just thought it was Su Buling who wanted to pull her alone to convince her. After struggling hard, she bit Su Buling's finger. Hiss. Su Buling quickly let go of his hand, and Ning Qingyi was about to yell again, but before he could open his mouth, his eyes went dark and he fell limp in Su Buling's arms. Su Buling's movements were gentle. After knocking Qingyi unconscious, he turned over and dismounted, leaving the two horses in a secluded place outside the city, then took out his weapons, carried Ning Qingyi on his back, and galloped upstream along the Beihe River. Su Buling's sudden return this time was naturally to solve the emperor's problem. Since Songji issued that aggressive imperial edict, it was obvious that he had already turned the table and made a desperate plan. If the Su family accepted the imperial edict and returned to Ziliang in silence, the situation would return to the previous state, being blocked outside Qianyang Pass, and the previous efforts would be in vain. If they rebelled without accepting the imperial edict, they could only take Guangzhou and defend it under the current situation. The Su family was a family of loyal martyrs. If they did so, they would first lose the righteousness and the people's hearts, and then be isolated and helpless. The Guangzhou army, the Liaxi army, and the three kings of the east would unite on the spot. Even if the Ziliang army could be pushed out, it would inevitably be a hard battle that would last for many years. Both of these choices were equivalent to falling into Songji's trap. In addition to the first time, Kui Zioan was alive and could be used as evidence to expose the dirty things Songji did in the past. In order to prevent the Su family from making a fuss about Kui Zioan, Songji would most likely arrange someone to kill Kui Zioan. No one could say whether the assassin would come to the door, but Su Buling felt that it would definitely happen. If a man was cheated to this extent and could still pretend not to see it, then he really had a problem with his brain. Songji had no master who could assassinate him, otherwise the assassin would come directly for him. Carrying Ning Qingyi on his back, he hurriedly walked among the mountains by the river and soon arrived near Fengshan. A little light could be seen on the river in the distance. Su Buling put Ning Qingyi down, lay down in the bushes, spread his cloak over the two of them, then took out a telescope and carefully watched the movements on the ship. The little sparrow flew to the top of the tree as a secret sentry to prevent anyone from grabbing their butts from behind. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Prince is Very Fierce. Author, Guan Gongzi. Chapter 686. The moon sets and the sun rises, the morning light shines on the calm river, the mountains and fields are silent, and there seems to be only a building boat parked in the river bend between heaven and earth. Su Buling maintained a prostrate posture, lying motionless in the grass. In order to prevent his whereabouts from being exposed during the day, he also sprinkled some fallen leaves and weeds on his cloak, holding a telescope to blend in with the mountains. Ning Qingyi lay flat in front of her. Maybe it was because the light was getting brighter during the day and it was a bit harsh. Her eyelashes trembled slightly and she opened her eyes. This is... Ning Qingyi's eyes were slightly dazed, and she looked at the tree crown above. After a while, her thoughts returned to her mind. Memories quickly came into her mind. The master was dangling his tail, leaving by himself. Su Buling caught up with him, and said hysterically that he liked him. I cried all the way, and then... It seemed like he was knocked unconscious. Anger flashed in Ning Qingyi's eyes, and before she could move, she found herself lying in the grass with something covering her body. Su Buling was lying next to him, and he could see his side face, so close. His body was very sore, and he was still it hurts a little. Ning Qingyi had been lying in her armor for several hours, and her body must have been sore and painful, but she obviously didn't expect this at this time. This bastard, could it be that he took me? Ning Qingyi's face turned pale, and then she became angry. She raised her hand to find her sword, and cursed angrily, you, Wu. Su Buling was aware of the sound before he even left it. He raised his hand to cover Ning Qingyi's mouth, pinned her to the ground and made a shushing gesture, don't make trouble, we are watching. Ning Qingyi almost went crazy, thinking that Su Buling had used force to knock her unconscious. Her eyes seemed to want to kill someone, but with a little tear in her eyes, she twisted hard and tried to turn her up, You. Su Buring had no choice but to raise his hand and knock on her breastplate. I didn't do anything to you. You are well dressed. There may be assassins around, so don't move. Ning Qingyi stared and felt carefully, only to find that the light armor on her body was intact, and there didn't seem to be any strange feeling underneath. She secretly breathed a sigh of relief. The anger in her eyes did not diminish, but she stopped struggling and just stared at Su Buling. Su Buling let go of his hand and continued to pick up the telescope to observe the boats on the river. Don't move around and don't speak loudly. I'm not lying to you. Ning Qingyi took a few breaths. She always knew right from wrong. Seeing that Su Buling didn't seem to be fooling her, she obeyed and said nothing. Just don't move or make any noise. Under such circumstances, is it possible for two people to lie here and chat in peace? Ning Qingyi clenched her hands tightly, wanting to get up and leave, never to see the scumbag who was eating from the bowl and looking at the pot again. But if what Su Buling said was true, he must not move around and expose his whereabouts now. Ning Qingyi stared at Su Buling for a moment, then turned over carefully and looked at the guards moving on the ship in the distance. Several maids came and went from time to time. The distance was too far to see clearly, but they didn't look strange. Ning Qingyi suppressed her anger and frustration and said coldly, "What happened on the ship?" Su Buling lay motionless in the grass and said softly, "The imperial court may send assassins here. Let's wait here to catch the big fish." Ning Qingyi didn't know what was going on, so she gritted her teeth and said, "How long do we have to wait? If it's quick, it will come at any time, if it's slow, it will come in a day or two at most." A day or two? Ning Qingyi didn't want to stay by Su Buling's side for a quarter of an hour. She wanted to have a few words with Su Buling, but she finally held it back and lay beside him without saying anything. Su Buling observed the surroundings of the building and saw that Ning Qingyi finally calmed down. After thinking about it, he said softly, "I know you don't want to see me, but I'm also confused about this matter. When we were in Chang'an City, when we first met, I deliberately let you kidnap me. I really thought you were beautiful and fell in love with your beauty." Ning Qingyi's eyes were slightly focused, not wanting to listen, and turned her cheek to the other side, but the words did not stop. "Later on, as I got to know you more, I gradually fell in love with you and Manzi. After all, I was in Chang'an City and had no friends. It was not easy to have someone to chat with. But there were a lot of things going on at the time, and I was likely to die soon. Yes, so I was more restrained in my feelings. Until that day, you came over and whispered into my ear. I thought for a moment, why would a man hesitate to pursue a girl? Difficulties can always be solved. If you miss love, you will really miss it, and then we kissed. Go up." Ning Qingyi's eyes showed shame and anger, and she whispered, "You are so lustful. I was whispering to you, and you took advantage of others' danger. Haha, I was really lustful at the time, but since I kissed you, I must like you. Later you left, and I couldn't leave Chang'an, so I didn't follow you. I thought I would find you after I left Chang'an. It's just that unexpectedly, he came over soon. I didn't know her identity at the time. She was besieged by Zhang Xiang and others. I rescued her, carried her to the small house, treated her injuries, and put all the clothes on her. Take off your clothes." Ning Qingyi turned around and asked, "Don't make excuses. You just think that my master is beautiful. Do you need to take off your clothes to treat the injury?" Su Buring looked a little helpless. She was hit by a poisonous needle at that time. She had to pull it out, but where was the poisonous needle? I had to look for it, right? I took off my shirt and couldn't find it, so I had to take off my pants. Touched it from top to bottom, and found 3 poisonous needles under the ribs. Ning Qingyi gritted his teeth. "Even so, if your life is at stake, you must obey authority urgently. Just like a doctor, you should not be tempted by lust. I didn't have any lustful intentions at the time. I was really just treating the injury. However, it is always not good for a woman to be clean, so I planned to wait for Yuhi to wake up and explain to her. But as soon as she woke up, she said she was your master. It scared me so much that I knew it was over, I was going to die. Bah! Ning Qingyi stared. I think it's too late for you to be happy. Su Buling turned around, very innocently. Why am I happy? It really scared me at the time. I didn't know how to solve it, so I had to hide it from Yuhi. In the end, Yuhi discovered it. Your master's temperament, you know, gentle and conservative. What is she keeping? She grew a tail yesterday, and what did you do? Ning Qingyi's face turned red and she found it difficult to speak. Su Buletinling's expression froze slightly and he said softly. They are an old couple, so it's normal to be open-minded. We were very gentle and conservative before, right? At that time, Yuhi already liked me a little, but he was afraid of affecting your lifelong events, so he was in a dilemma and directly took the full Ji ran away. What can I do? I can't choose one of the two and forget about the other. I will look for you and Yuhi as soon as I get out of Chang'an City. Insatiable and shameless. I didn't like you yet. You should have gone after my master. Why did you come to me? Sigh, I went looking for it anyway. First I found Yuhi in Jingmen. She was also looking for you at that time, and then we went to Cao's house in Juncheon together. After meeting you, Yuhi felt that he could not hinder your marriage and had to marry me. I broke off the relationship, but she made a prediction for herself that she and I were destined to be married, so she decided to be a romantic couple and end the marriage. Ning Qingyi's eyes were stunned. You are talking nonsense. What kind of severing of relations is this? Yes, I was shocked at the time and said no, once we are destined to be together, how can we forget each other? But Yuhi didn't believe it, and insisted on saying, God's will is unbreakable, and he wanted to get married to me first, and then break off the relationship. I already had skin-to-skin contact with Yuhi, and I wanted to take responsibility, but I wasn't very resolute in resisting, and then what happened? Yuhi regretted it afterward, but it was too late to regret, because he was afraid that you would be sad after knowing it, so he could only I kept this from you. Ning Qingyi pursed her lips and said in a cold voice, in that case, you and Master can stay together forever. Master cares about me. Don't you have any idea and have to hide it from me and coax me on board with her? Su Buling looked at Ning Qingyi with serious eyes. I like you too, and naturally I don't want you to be sad for the rest of your life. I am the crown prince. According to ancient rituals, I can marry more than 100 wives. If I can take full responsibility, why should I care about one thing and not the other? Why are you so thick-skinned? Ning Qingyi glared at Su Buling, then turned her head away, not wanting to talk to him. Su Buling smiled, you can scold me if you want, you still have to live your life. I want to be a gentleman with peace of mind and the beauty of others. There is no such good thing in the world. It will allow you to live a peaceful life. It's shameless to be shameless. Ning Qingyi took a few breaths and wanted to say something back, but she had not spoken much since she was a child, and she didn't know what to say at this time. After enduring it for a long time, he just whispered. You are just a pervert. If I couldn't beat you, I would have castrated you with one sword. Then your master will fight you tooth and nail. Ning Qingyi closed her eyes, lay down in the grass, and stopped talking. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 687. Fengshan is surrounded by dense forests and is sparsely visited. At the bottom of the mountains far away from Beihe, a natural cave is hidden under lush vines. Outside the entrance of the cave are two top disciples of the palace, paying attention to the surrounding movements. Guessing that the imperial court might come to assassinate Kui Zioan, Xiao Qi could not put all her family members on the boat as bait. On the day when the news of Su Buling breaking Xiangyang came back, she secretly moved several women to the mountains and hid them under cover of night. She was left alone on the boat to hide from others. The cave was found temporarily. It is very narrow and long, and I don't know how deep it is. Although it is very cool in summer, it is obviously not a place for people to live. Deep in the cave, there is an open space with a radius of 2 feet, covered with floor mats and lit with oil lamps. Several women are standing or sitting together. Xiao Xiang'er was used to holding back in the palace and was quite stable. She was leaning against the stone wall, holding a small carving knife in her hand and carefully carving a white jade plaque. Chiao Yi was beside her handing over the tools. Lu Hongluan and Song Yufu sat together, holding needles and threads in their hands, passing the time by embroidering in the light of the candle light. Zhu Manzi, who had always been lively and active, was obviously a little confused. He hid in the cave for several days, unable to speak loudly or go out for air. It felt like being in prison. Zhu Manzi held a small wooden stick, stood next to the floor and played with the Tai Chi sword, and asked softly, "Sister Xiang'er, how long will we be detained?" Xiao Xiang'er didn't know for sure, so she sighed, "We should go out soon, just wait a little longer." Kui Zioan didn't like to stay in crowded places, so she was sitting alone in the corner of the winding stone cave, looking at the small wooden sign in her hand in a daze. Hearing Xiao Xiang'er's voice, Kui Zioan turned around and said, "Mother, is the emperor coming to kill me?" Xiao Xiang'er knew some inside information from Xiao Qi, but she wasn't sure, it was just a guess. She didn't want to talk nonsense about such a major event that might make the Su family rebel against the imperial court, so she just said, "Probably not. Although Song Ji is a bit stubborn, he seems to be okay with you." Kui Zioan shook her head, a little dissatisfied. "The emperor always feels that he is superior. He just has no friends and I am not afraid of him, so he only talks to me. Now I am cheating. Hong Xing is cheating." Zhu Manzi, who was playing Tai Chi sword, stumbled, lost his balance and fell to the floor. Xiao Xiang'er shook his hand and carved the rooster into a red flamingo. As soon as the words came out, the whole cave looked up in astonishment and looked at Kui Zioan with strange expressions. Kui Zioan noticed that the girls had strange expressions and smiled. "For the emperor, it's Hong Xing's affair, right, Queen Mother?" Well, what could Xiao Xiang'er say? After holding back for a long time, Xiao Xiang'er nodded lightly, "Absolutely." The sun and the moon passed by in the blink of an eye, and it was night again. There was no movement inside and outside the river under Fengshan Mountain. Su Buling lay down in the grass in the distance, holding a telescope in his hand, and kept talking for a whole day. Ning Qingyi couldn't run, Wu Ren's hearing was well developed, and he could still hear even if he covered his ears. Originally, his heart was full of grievances, anger, sadness, and other emotions. After being forced to recite the sutra for a day, now he was just annoyed. And when preparing for war, you need to maintain your physical strength, and you can't go on a hunger strike without eating. Ning Qingyi was lying in the grass, holding dry food in her hand and nibbling in small mouths. Her expression was dull, and she didn't know what face to put on when facing Su Buling. Seeing the lights on the building boat turn on again, she said coldly, "Are you fooling me? If you want me to have a good talk with you, just say so. If you find such a lame excuse to crawl in the hay for a day, aren't you bullying an honest person?" Su Buling held the telescope motionless. "If you bear with me any longer, didn't you notice that Manzi didn't go out all day? With Manzi's temper, if he stays on the boat, he will definitely take the dog around every corner." Ning Qingyi thought for a while and felt that it made sense, so she patiently continued to lie down in a daze. To be honest, after such a day and night of turmoil, no matter how angry it is time to calm down, but it is obvious that I still have no idea how to deal with the current situation. It was impossible for her to sever her relationship with her master. The two options before her were either compromise and the three of them live together from now on, or they could live without contact with Su Buling until death. Ning Qingyi has not had as many sorrows as ordinary women since she was a child, but it was easy to get Su Buling's advantage. Obviously, it was not possible. At this time, she could only stop thinking about it and said coldly, "I'm warning you. I told you before that the reason for using force against Chu Chu is because Chu Chu is stupid. No matter what you do to her, she will never be angry with you. I, Ning Qingyi, am not the kind of woman who is submissive. If you dare to fight, I will commit suicide immediately for the idea of cooking rice from raw rice. Don't think that I can't do it." Seeing that Qingyi's mood had improved a lot, Su Buling secretly breathed a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "How could I do that kind of thing? Manzi wants to wait until we get married and won't let me touch her. I'm not always honest." "Why are you so honest? Do you think I don't know what you did to Manzi?" Su Buling was stunned and turned his head. "What did I do to Manzi?" Ning Qingyi's eyes were slightly cold. "What you did to me, you did to Manzi. Before we were married, you insulted the innocence of a woman. If you hadn't been disrespectful of etiquette, how could I be in such trouble now? How can this be called humiliating a woman's innocence? Aren't you quite devoted? You. Hey, shh. Su Buling was talking when something strange suddenly flashed in the corner of the telescope. He raised his head slightly and used the telescope to carefully check that direction. He saw a very difficult to distinguish black shadow flashed in the bushes on the shore of the building ship under the moonlight, and then disappeared under the huge rocks beside the river beach. Then, like an invisible shadow, it slid into the water and disappeared without causing any splashes. The guards on the building ship did not notice it. Ning Qingyi noticed Su Buling's unusual movement, leaned down slightly, and whispered, "Is there any movement? Someone is approaching the building ship, let's go." Su Buling stood up silently, with his sword crossed at his waist and a steel gun in his hand. He moved towards the building ship in the night. Ning Qingyi was wearing a white skirt. In order to avoid being discovered, she wrapped a black cloak around her body and followed closely with a long sword tightly in her hand. The two took only a few steps and saw another figure appear from somewhere else and stayed in the bushes far away from the building ship, as if he was watching. There are more than one person, definitely not ordinary people. You and Yi just need to pay attention to the surrounding movements, don't interfere, I can handle it alone. Su Buling became more cautious, lowered his body and slowed down his pace, carefully observing the surroundings to determine how many people were on the other side. Ning Qingyi's martial arts were good, but he was far behind Su Buling. At this time, he could only nod silently and hide in a hidden place. "The update has been a bit slow these 2 days, I'm really sorry orts. Double monthly votes at the end of the month, big guys can save until the end of the month to vote. The prince is very fierce." Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 688. It was a dark and windy night. The ship was anchored in the river bay, and the guards patrolled back and forth on the deck. The laughter of women playing could be heard from time to time in the night. Lao Yi silently dived from the bottom of the water to the bottom of the ship, jumped onto the top of the ship close to the stern, and listened to the movement in the room below. From yesterday to today, the three of them watched in the dark for a day. During this period, Xiao Qi came out to hand over to the guards several times, and the maids often showed up, but Queen Kui never came out from beginning to end. As a secret guard in the palace, he naturally understood Queen Kui. She was lonely and liked to live alone. She had no habit of going out to relax. Even on the ship, it was normal for her to hide in the room alone for several months. If the time was too long, it would be easy to go wrong. Lao Yi could only sneak into the ship and explore by sound. The ship was not too big. With Lao Yi's skills, it would not take long to explore a circle. If he really couldn't find Queen Kui's whereabouts, he could only retreat temporarily to avoid alerting Su Buling and making preparations in advance. 10 feet away from the building ship, behind the bushes on the river beach, Song Ying held a weapon and silently stuck to the ground, almost blending in with the grass and trees. As a master-level expert, it was easy for him to hold his breath for 2/4 of an hour, and hiding his body was naturally a piece of cake. He was not discovered by the guards at a distance of 10 feet. If there was anything unusual, he could also rush onto the boat and kill the guards with one blow. Song Ying watched the guards' every move, his expression focused, and waited quietly. But not long after Lao Yi got on the boat, Song Ying's ears suddenly moved slightly, and he heard a rustling sound from a distance, as if a snake was crawling over the grass nearby, and the sound was extremely small. If it were an ordinary person, he would not be able to detect the slight noise mixed in the sound of the river, but Song Ying had been in the rivers and lakes for many years, and the people he dealt with were all extremely difficult A-level bandits. He was much more cautious than ordinary people. Just the moment the sense of crisis rose in his heart, the goose feather knife on his waist had already been unsheathed. Clang! In the dark night, a white rainbow suddenly lit up, and a strong wind rose by the river. Su Buling, who had just touched 10 feet away, noticed that the black-clothed man in front of him had moved his shoulder, and knew that he had been discovered. Without hesitation, he shook the ground with his feet, and jumped out from a crawling posture. His robe flew horizontally, almost bending the surrounding bushes. Song Ying unsheathed his goose feather knife, tapped the ground with his left hand, and the whole person turned over. His movements were experienced and swift. Without turning back, he slashed at the place where the sound came from. Su Buling jumped up 10 feet away, but rushed to the front in an instant. He unsheathed the single knife in his hand, turned around and slashed it in the air. The most powerful and domineering 28 continuous knives he had learned came up. The horrifying force made Song Ying stagger at the first strike, and he stepped back unsteadily. Before he could turn around, the second strike fell again. Song Ying's eyes were full of astonishment. He didn't even have a chance to think, and quickly raised his knife to block. Ding ding ding. In the blink of an eye, 3 knives had already landed on Song Ying's knife, and sparks flew along the river bank. Until then, the guards on the building ship noticed it, and they all drew their knives and looked towards the river bank. On the building ship, while Su Buling attacked like a tide, he shouted loudly, reminding the guards of the palace to pay attention to the top of their heads. Lao Yi, who was lying on the top of the building ship, had already sensed something was wrong when Song Ying drew his knife, and jumped down from the building like a falcon swooping down on a rabbit. The guards of the palace on the deck were all the retainers of the Suwang who had been kept for many years. They might not be masters, but they were not the fish that could be killed by one knife. When they found the strong wind coming from above, they immediately dodged to the side and drew their knives to fight back. But in an instant, the river bay, which had been calm just now, was full of swords and shadows. Song Ying made 3 consecutive slashes and saw clearly that it was Su Buling in front of him. His face suddenly changed. He was trapped by the 28-way chain knife, and his strength was weaker than Su Buling. He would be dead or disabled without waiting for the 28 slashes to be completed. Thinking of this, Song Ying said angrily, "It's Su Buling." Song Ying. Su Buling recognized Song Ying from the voice, and his eyes immediately turned cold. He would not hold back at all, and the blade was like rain, and every slash went straight to the vital point. On the ship, Lao Yi, who was fighting with 3 swords, found Su Buling nearby and knew that he had been tricked. The primary goal of this trip was to kill Queen Kui. He did not assassinate Su Buling because he was not sure and was afraid of failing to alert the enemy. Compared with Queen Kui, Su Buling's value was obviously much higher. Now that he was in front of her, he didn't have to think about what to do. Lao Yi held the knife in both hands, and the third knife was tied to the braid behind his head. In just 2 or 3 moves, he forced the guards to retreat, jumped off the deck of the building, and smashed towards Su Buling like a mountain. The 28-way chain knife was created by the knife leader Sidu Yuejin. It is fierce and domineering, and only attacks but not defends. When the strength is similar, it is almost invincible in a single fight. But the disadvantage is that it can only lock one person, and someone intervenes and the combo breaks itself. Sensing the cold coming from behind, Su Buling chopped the knife to the back with a single knife, and the left-hand sword was unsheathed at the same time, blocking the 2 knives on the left and right. Lao Yi saw the opportunity and his eyes turned cold. He shook his head suddenly, and the straight knife dragging on his hair turned into a steel whip in an instant, swept from the side, and chopped Su Buling's neck. Being able to rank below Jia Gong in the Emperor's Guards, Lao Yi's martial arts attainments have long been superb. The third knife is no different from holding it in his hand. When fighting against someone, it is equivalent to having 3 hands. Ordinary warriors don't even know how to defend. Song Ying, who was knocked back by the blow and had not yet stabilized, was overjoyed when he saw this scene. It was true that Su Buling was a master of martial arts, but he only had 2 hands. He held the sharp blades with both hands to defend against the 2 knives, and there was nothing to block the third knife. Even if he didn't die, he would at least be seriously injured. However, the joy in Song Yu's eyes just appeared, and it turned into astonishment in an instant. Su Buling, who was unable to defend himself with his hands blocking the knife, turned his head and bit the flying blade. The cold straight knife could have cut off half of Su Buling's head if it had moved forward half an inch, but it stopped abruptly in front of Su Buling. The dangerous scene frightened Ning Qingyi, who was watching from a distance. Lao Yi had lived for more than 50 years, and this was the first time he encountered such a broken move. Although he was stunned, his movements were not slow at all. He quickly turned his head and tried to pull the straight knife back, cutting off half of Su Buling's face. It was just that when the top warriors fought, being broken meant being passive. The moment Su Buling bit the long knife, he used his hands to block the 2 knives, and lightly tapped his toes to rise from the ground. The extremely powerful Bajiquan tiger mountain climbing had already reached Lao Yi's chest. Bang! The next moment the 2 men fought hand to hand, Lao Yi's tall body was knocked into the air. Su Buling cut off the hair that bound the straight sword with a back-handed knife, and threw the long sword in his left hand with all his strength to pierce Lao Yi's heart. At the same time, he grasped the handle of the straight sword that he had bitten, and swung the 2 swords like the wind, slashing Lao Yi's vital points all over his body. The situation reversed in an instant, and Lao Yi's eyes showed shock. He had expected Su Buling's martial arts to be strong, but he had never expected it to be so strong. Compared with the crazy Su Buling who ascended the dragon platform in previous years, it was a world of difference. Lao Yi's face turned blue after being hit by a knee in the chest. After raising his knife to slash the flying long sword, he tried his best to parry the double sword slashed by Su Buling. Song Ying in the back barely stabilized, and the situation in front of him had become Lao Yi being beaten one-sidedly. He flew forward without hesitation, and the blade went straight to Su Buling's back. Seeing Song Ying approaching, Su Buling spun out and slashed behind him with a straight sword, and at the same time caught the long sword falling from the sky and continued to hit Lao Yi. 2 masters of the Grand Master level, and not masters like Tang Jiao who were just filling in the numbers, it was obviously impossible for Su Buling to kill them instantly without any effort, but Su Buling was not going to fight alone. The guards of the palace had already jumped off the ship and surrounded them from all directions. Ning Qingyi also came nearby with a weapon and pressed towards Song Ying from behind. 10 guards of the palace would definitely not be able to beat Lao Yi and Song Ying in a single fight, but with Su Buling's powerful weapon, as long as one of them could be restrained, it would be a matter of time before the other one was killed. Seeing that he was surrounded, Lao Yi deliberately slowed down a little when Su Buling's blade stabbed at him, causing the straight knife to stab through his ribs. Kaka. Su Buling thrust out his knife, but found that the feel was not right, and his heart was chilled. Run. The moment the words came out, the porcelain bottle that was pierced under Lao Yi's ribs burst out a large ball of thick black mist, which enveloped the three people fighting. The river bank was suddenly filled with ghostly air. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 689. Dragon Locking Gu. The guards and Ning Qingyi who rushed forward changed their expressions instantly. With Su Buling's reminder, they almost dodged behind the edge of the spreading poisonous fog. The poisonous fog spread rapidly, covering a distance of more than 10 feet in a blink of an eye. Su Buling was trapped in it, but there was no fear in his eyes. The imperial court had only one dragon locking gu, and the source of the poisonous fog was obviously the dragon locking gu that he had been poisoned with last time. After the poison was removed, he had resistance to it. Moreover, anyone who had raised the dragon locking gu would be immune to the poison for life. He was basically poisoned, and at most he would ask Xiao Qi to remove it again. Song Ying was too close, and he didn't expect Lao Yi to be so cruel, so he didn't have time to dodge. Surrounded by the poisonous fog, his face turned pale instantly, and he said angrily, "Lao Yi, you." Lao Yi had no expression on his face, and avoided Su Buling's gap with a knife. He flipped his fingers and ejected a pill, which he sent to Song Ying's hand. There is an antidote, quick and decisive. Song Ying breathed a sigh of relief, took the pill and swallowed it without hesitation, then raised his knife again and stepped forward to lock Su Buling's retreat. Before the emperor used the dragon locking gu on Su Buling, he had exhausted all his resources to find the antidote for the dragon locking gu. Lao Yi's move would be best if Su Buling could be poisoned, but if not, it could also limit the battlefield. The effect of the dragon locking gu was significant after it was thrown out. Everyone knew that if they were poisoned, they would not live long. Even if the guests of the palace were determined to die, they could not give up their lives without saying a word. At this time, they were all forced out of the poisonous fog. Although the dragon locking gu poisonous fog drove away the reinforcements, the situation was not a disadvantage for Su Buling. Su Buling had been poisoned for more than a year in Chang'an, and had been accustomed to the pain of thousands of ants gnawing at his heart day and night. At this time, the poison had just entered his tendons, veins and lungs, and it was no different from tickling for him. He had not experienced this familiar feeling for a long time, and even felt a little nostalgic. Although Lao Yi and Song Ying had antidotes to suppress it, the antidote was obviously not effective so quickly after swallowing it. The severe pain of the poison mist corroding their limbs and bones made both of them turn pale. Song Ying endured the severe pain and disordered breath, and shouted angrily, "Die!" The Yanling knife in his hand was used as a sword, and the Junshan Cao family's signature skill Dragon Gate 3 Nox was stabbed out quickly. Seeing Song Ying attacking again, Su Buling slashed at Lao Yi with both knives, and his right leg swept behind him like a dragon's tail, and his heel kicked Song Ying's knife accurately. Dragon Gate 3 Nox is famous for its speed, but Su Buling's kick was half a minute faster than Song Ying's. Song Ying's single-edged sword was kicked and tricked, and it was about to lose its grip, and it swayed to the side. Lao Yi saw that Su Buling was hit by the dragon locking gu, but his movements were not affected at all, and even his face did not change. His eyes were puzzled and surprised, but his hands seemed to move quickly, and he still seized the rare opportunity to try to kill Su Buling together. Gun. Su Buling kicked Song Ying back, and felt that it was a bit difficult to fight, so he shouted urgently. Ning Qingyi, who was standing outside the poisonous fog, hurriedly threw the steel gun he was carrying with all his strength, stabbing Song Ying's back. Su Buling chopped Lao Yi back with two swords, lightly touched the ground and flew back, and threw two swords in the air, stabbing the two people one after the other. Su Buling was instructed by Jia Gong in the Tang family, but he never ignored it. He lived with the ladies on weekdays and never missed practicing martial arts every day. Today, when Su Buling fights with others, he no longer has the might of a bull charging forward like in the past, but his martial arts attainments have obviously improved. He is like a butterfly among flowers, and he moves forward and backward with ease, just right and without any error. After catching the steel spear in mid-air, Su Buling's momentum changed again. Before he landed on the ground, he burst out with a roar, and his white robe suddenly tightened, and the cloth on his back was almost torn by his towering muscles. The steel spear in his hand turned into a divine whip the moment he got it, and smashed from mid-air to Song Ying's landing point. The gun god swept through the poisonous fog and swept a black trail in mid-air. Song Ying held the back of the knife with his left hand and raised the knife to block, but the sword in his hand was bent by the steel spear, and the back of the knife sank into half of his palm. Then a huge force like a mountain came, and the spear fell on his shoulder, and the sound of bone cracking sounded immediately. Bang! Song Ying, who was wearing night clothes, was smashed into the riverbank at the moment when the iron spear came to him. Half of him was stuck in the mud and sand, and blood gushed out of his mouth. The guards of the palace who were watching saw the scene and were all shocked. They knew that their young prince had amazing martial arts, but they didn't expect that he would become so much stronger in just half a year. Su Buling didn't have the habit of fighting and talking. He took advantage of the victory and wanted to blow up Song Ying's head with a shot, but Lao Yi behind him rushed over and stabbed Su Buling in the back with two knives upside down. Song Ying was pale after this blow. At the moment when Lao Yi rescued him, he endured the severe pain in his shoulders and palms, turned over from the mud and sand, and rushed towards the mountains. Su Buling was entangled by the fearless Lao Yi, and had no time to care about Song Ying. He raised his spear and stabbed 13 times, stabbing Lao Yi's feet with the spear every 5 steps, forcing Lao Yi, who was holding a short weapon and could not get close to him, to retreat a few steps. Then he kicked the spear shaft fiercely, and the spear sword bounced up, opening a bloody wound on Lao Yi's sturdy body. Song Ying. Seeing Song Ying fleeing in a panic, Lao Yi was furious. After shouting, he wanted to escape from the poisonous fog. However, in a one-on-one duel in the poisonous fog, Su Buling had a great advantage, so how could he let his opponent escape? He swept away the straight knife thrown back by Lao Yi while running, and raised his hand to sweep Lao Yi's right leg with a spear. There was a crisp sound, and Lao Yi's right leg was bent and deformed on the spot. Lao Yi groaned, knowing that there was no hope of escape, and let the stabbing spear pour into his right chest. He twisted his body to block the spear tip and chopped Su Buling's forehead with the remaining long sword. A mantis trying to stop a chariot. Su Buling's eyes were cold and devoid of any mercy. He let go of the gun and slid his right hand down against the blade. His 5 fingers were like hooks and they were caught in Lao Bi's hands. His left hand was like a poisonous snake spitting out a message, and it closed at the touch of Lao Bi's throat. Puff. His voice was soft, like a dragonfly touching water, but Lao Yi's copper bell-like eyes were suddenly filled with bloodshot eyes. He grabbed the iron gun that pierced his chest with his right hand, and covered his throat with his left hand. He took 2 steps back, wanting to say something, but nothing came out. He just stared at Su Buling and slowly fell to his knees on the ground. Su Bulenling stopped his hand neatly and didn't bother to look at the expression of the corpse. He turned around and chased Song Ying. However, as soon as he turned around, his expression suddenly changed. The fight lasted only a moment. On the river beach, the guards and Ning Qingyi stayed outside the poisonous mist. Song Ying was rescued by Lao Yi and fled frantically towards the mountains and forests with a knife in hand. Ning Qingyi's eyes came over the mountains and happened to be on the way of Song Ying's escape. Ning Qingyi had already recognized the identity of the masked man in black using Song Ying's Cao family's special skill of Longmen 3 knocks. Back then, Ning Qingyi's mother, Pei Yun, went from a wandering heroine to a wanted criminal hiding in Tibet because Song Ying set up a trap to betray her friends for glory. If it hadn't been for Song Ying's frame-up, her mother might still have stayed in Chang'an City to accompany Li Hanzheng to take the imperial examination. Regardless of whether he passed the exam or not, nothing that happened later would have happened. Ning Qingyi had always wanted revenge in the past, but she only dared to assassinate Zhang Xiang. Song Ying's identity was mysterious and her martial arts skills were too high. Even if she saw him, she could only hide away and never had a chance. Now, Song Ying had her shoulder and half of her hand broken by Su Buling, and was hit by the locking dragon Gu. She seemed to be at the end of her rope. Seeing the opponent rushing towards her, Ning Qingyi naturally did not give way and wanted to stop Song Ying. It's just that a skinny camel is bigger than a horse. Just like Teng Xiao, a master is a master. Even Teng Xiao, the shame of Wu Kuei, can beat 3 Zhang Xiangs. Song Ying, who can fight Zulu, not to mention broke his left arm. Even if both hands are broken, his legs alone can kick many of the guards to death. Song Ying was already out of the cage. When she saw the ants blocking her way, she immediately slashed Ning Qingyi with a knife in one hand. Rustle. The power of the blade wielded with all its strength is extremely frightening. When Ning Qingyi saw this scene, he realized something was wrong and quickly raised his sword to block. The surrounding guards also yelled and tried to save the siege, but it was obviously too late. If he was hit this time, even if he blocked it with a sword and was wearing light armor, he would still be seriously injured. Su Barang's eyes were furious, and he quickly kicked with all his strength on the pebbles on the river beach. This kick was probably the most powerful one Su Buletinling had ever used since he started practicing martial arts. The pebbles as big as his head were directly kicked into pieces. Hundreds of gravels shot out, like a rain of arrows, causing a buzzing sound in the night. The sound enveloped Song Ying. The Yanling saber was knocked away by the gravel in mid-air. Song Ying, who was running, swept away part of the gravel with her sleeves, but was still riddled with holes. She fell to the ground with a groan. Su Buletinling flew up like thunder, and then fell from the sky like a mountain. His knee hit Song Ying's back, who was trying to get up, breaking his spine on the spot. He then bounced up and landed in front of Ning Qingyi. He raised his hand and slapped Ning Qingyi on the armor skirt. "What are you talking about? Are you not afraid of death if I tell you not to interfere?" His attitude was very fierce, and he was still angry after the fight. With the blessing of the dragon locking Gu, his face was ashen, and he looked very scary. Ning Qingyi was so frightened that she froze on the spot with her sword in hand. Her butt hurt, but she didn't dare to say anything. Under the gaze, she actually averted her eyes. I'm sorry." Su Buling glared twice, and after seeing that nothing was wrong, he calmed down his emotions, breathed a sigh of relief, and looked around a few times. "Put the body away, bring me a jug of wine, and then go pick up Aunt Lu and the others. Promise." The palace guards had been playing soy sauce, and now they were a little embarrassed. They nodded quickly and went down to collect the bodies and get drinks. Ning Qingyi was indeed a little frightened just now. She originally wanted to have a cold war with Su Buling, but now she couldn't be cold anymore. She secretly glanced at Su Buling, saw that Su Buling's face was ashen, and said softly, "Are you poisoned? Are you okay? What do you think?" Su Buling was hit by the lock dragon Gu again. His limbs were itchy and painful. He didn't want to resist. He took a few gulps of the liquor handed over by the guard and walked quickly towards the building. "You follow the guards and bring Man Zi and the others back. I have to find Xiao Qi to detoxify them." Ning Qingyi had lived on the building boat for so long, so he naturally knew how to cure the poison, so he turned around and left with the guards without saying much. Just as the two of them separated, the sound of flapping wings was heard in the distance, and the little sparrows flew out of the woods and chirped around Su Buling's head, obviously very anxious. Su Buling's expression changed, knowing that there must be movement in the woods. Without any hesitation, he picked up the weapon from the ground and rushed towards the woods. The prince is very fierce. Author, Guan Guan Gong Zi. Chapter 690. Earlier, in the woods. With his hands folded in his sleeves, he looked old despite his young age. He stood under a pine tree and watched Lao Yi and Song Ying approach the ship. Like eunuch Jia, he had been in the palace since he was young. From spring, summer, autumn, and winter to the 12 hours of each day, he was doing what he should do as a person of this status. He was like a beast on the Taiji palace, watching everything in and outside the palace, trying not to make any mistakes in his life. Queen Kui did not show up on the ship all day. Since he did not see Queen Kui, he had to think of all the possibilities, such as the other party had guessed the assassination and the ship in front of him was just a bait. Leaving someone behind always had a basis for advance and retreat. In fact, the guess was correct. Not long after Lao Yi got on the ship, a black shadow touched the river beach, and then the blade was like a tide. The death soldier took a look and did not show up to rescue, but turned and walked into the woods. Long before coming, the death soldier saw that Song Ying had no intention of fighting, and Su Buling's 28 continuous knife also exposed his strength, and Lao Yi could not beat him. He might have beaten him in the past, but it was only a possibility. His adoptive father taught him since he was a child that he must be foolproof in everything he did, because as he lived for a long time, he would always encounter a few accidents. Only when he was sure that there was no mistake, he could not make any mistakes. The task assigned by the emperor this time was to kill Queen Kui. If other goals might fail, he should first ensure that killing Queen Kui was foolproof. Since the building ship was a bait, Queen Kui was definitely not on the ship. The guards and Su Buling were all near the building ship, and it was impossible to leave Queen Kui too far away, so that they could not rush to help in time, so Queen Kui must be hiding nearby. The death soldier walked among the mountains, seemingly slow but actually fast, searching for any possible hiding places, and also looking for clues that might remain on the ground. This search was obviously effective. In the woods approaching the cave at the foot of the mountain, Death Soldier finally found a figure. It was a dark and windy night. There was no light in the woods. A vague black shadow appeared between the two trees in front. The black shadow looked old and dying, but he stood under the tree motionless, just like a wooden stake that had stood there for many years. Ordinary people might subconsciously ignore it when they walked up to it. Death Soldier recognized who it was, but there was no emotion in his eyes. After all, since he could remember, no one had taught him about emotions. He had no self. He only cared about the things he had to do and the duties of Death Soldier. Death Soldier stopped 10 feet away from the figure and said calmly, "Adoptive father." Eunuch Jia's appearance may not have changed in the past decades. He put his hands into his sleeves and half closed his eyes. He looked around and said kindly, "Did the emperor ask you to kill Queen Kui?" "Yes, my adoptive father has retired and returned to his hometown. He shouldn't be here." He. Eunuch Jia sighed and shook his head, "The work is not done. In my life, I have adopted 2 adopted sons. In the past, I only thought about teaching martial arts and didn't think about anything else. Now I have retired and returned to my hometown. I wanted to return to my roots, but I found that I couldn't die. After thinking about it carefully, I realized that I have done everything perfectly in this life, but I haven't done well as a person." Death Soldier listened quietly, indifferent to the tragic fighting in the distance, just waiting for Eunuch Jia to finish his words. An adopted son is also a son, and he must fulfill his responsibilities. Jia Yi is dead, and it is not enough to just bury him. The only thing he did in his life was to protect Queen Kui, and it was the same until his death. But Queen Kui is not dead, so Jia Yi's work is not finished. As his adopted father, I have to help him finish it. Got it, adopted father. The death soldier bowed, then strode forward, with 2 golden threads hanging from his sleeves, sweeping across the leaves and weeds on the road, and then split into 2 in silence. Eunuch Jia sighed softly, but did not say anything. After all, this adopted son was taught by him. Everything was good, but he just didn't live like a human being. Swoosh. In the woods with only starlight but no moonlight, the subtle but sharp sound of breaking wind was dense and dense. 4 golden threads danced with the sleeves, weaving through the dense woods like threading a needle. The trees and gravel looked like tofu in front of the golden threads. The golden threads silently passed through the trees, and the trees did not fall, leaving only fallen leaves that split in 2 like flying snow. 2 shadows, so fast that only after images were left, wandered ghostly in the woods, so fast that it was difficult to see clearly, but even the fluttering sound of the robes was useless, making the scene look dead and weird. Occasionally, the 2 shadows passed by each other, and separated as soon as they touched, without leaking any force, and there was no trace of the ground or the countryside. Swish, swish, swish. The subtle sounds of pulling strings were dense, and the forest with a radius of 10 feet gradually formed a large golden net under the movement of the 2 figures. The speed was getting faster and faster, and under the blockade of the golden threads that would kill anyone who touched them, there was less and less space for movement. As the 2 shadows intersected more and more frequently, they could finally hear some panting, the panting of exhaustion and exhaustion. Death Soldier noticed that Eunuch Jia was unable to do his best, but his eyes did not change at all. Unlike Jia Yi, Death Soldier was raised by Eunuch Jia since he was a child, accompanied and taught him carefully day and night until the day he took over Eunuch Jia's position. But all this is meaningless, because Death Soldier has no name, no friends, no prospects, and no feelings since he can remember. Death Soldier can be said to be the sword raised by Eunuch Jia, the sharpest sword in the world. This should have been Eunuch Jia's masterpiece of his life, but Eunuch Jia couldn't be proud of it at this time, because the sword is a dead object, and people are alive. It was wrong to raise his son as a weapon from the beginning. Eunuch Jia was born in a small village in Liaodong. He may not remember his parents or the local accent, but he came from home after all. When he was a child, he stood in the courtyard like the kid in the small village in his hometown. At the edge of the dam, he looked stupidly at the strangers passing by. He might have been a little stupid, but at that time he was still a human being. Back in the small village in Liaodong, Eunuch Jia was lying in the pit he dug for himself. He wanted to die but could not give up his breath. This was because he had lived a whole life and seemed to have no regrets, but when he thought about it, he was full of regrets. He adopted 2 adopted sons, both of whom were dead soldiers. One was raised as a weapon, and the other was kept in the dark and became a fool. Neither of them had the chance to live their life according to their own ideas like him. It was Eunuch Jia's choice to become the dead soldier. In that era of hungry cannibals, he found his own way, but the dead soldier in front of him didn't even know what he was. Obviously something was wrong. As a foster father, Eunuch Jia should let him choose at least once. Rustle rustle. The fight intensified, and the sound of robes waving gradually sounded in the woods. Death Soldier remains expressionless, like a machine, breaking moves, splitting moves, attacking, and moving around, all just right, without any flaw, without leaving any omissions, like an unstoppable wave, destroying his adoptive father who once personally taught him martial arts. After slowly being pushed into a desperate situation, even after 10 moves, the foster father will die in front of him. Eunuch Jia has been immersed in martial arts all his life, so he can count these things, but unlike the dead soldier, Eunuch Jia is still a human being. Just as he was about to touch the golden thread on the back of his head, Eunuch Jia sighed softly. There is an old saying in the world, teach the disciple and starve the master to death, so. Bang. As soon as he finished speaking, the scrawny eunuch Jia's aura suddenly changed, turning from softness to strength. His upper body robes were torn to pieces, and the bones all over his body creaked. His skinny 5 fingers turned into a pair of iron fists, which made a loud bang in the air and touched death. Shijia's chest. Eunuch Jia spent his entire life learning 1,000 layers of miasma, and when he practiced it to great perfection, he was like a willow leaf following the wind, and his swords, fists, and feet were all weak. But this lack of effort is based on one's own prediction and speed being faster than the opponent. When the speed and strength reach a certain level, it is just 100 pounds of mortal flesh. How can there be no saying that one does not focus on it? When he was in the Tang family, Su Buling was able to defeat Eunuch Jia by relying on his surprise and power to shake the dragon and tiger, but Eunuch Jia's pair of old fists that had never been shown before almost squeezed all the energy out of his body. Everything he did was fast and powerful. As long as he hit the chest and abdomen, it was no surprise that he could be punched through with his bare hands. There was still no expression in the eyes of Death Soldier A. He just tried his best to block with his right hand and turned his left hand into a knife to counterattack. After all, this is the only thing he can do now. Attack him and save him. Cha! After a muffled sound, the forest interspersed with golden threads became quiet, and 2 figures stood still. Eunuch Jia's shoulders rose and fell slightly, his fist rested on the chest of the dead soldier, pressing tightly against the cloth, with a bit of pride in his eyes. How's it going? How is your adoptive father's hand? For the first time, there was an expression in Death Soldier A's eyes, but it was just confusion. He looked at his left hand that was poured into his chest and said calmly, "Father, you kept your hand." Eunuch Jia laughed, took 2 steps back, sat down unsteadily against the big tree behind, and raised his hand. "You are dead, and the matter is settled. From now on, learn to be a human being. When you learn how to do it, burn some paper money for me, and then burn some for your brother." Death Soldier stood there, looking at the undamaged robe on his chest, and did not move for a long time. "Let's go, dead soldier, it's enough to die once. We are all raised by our father and mother, how can we always live for others? By the way, I forgot to give you a name. My surname is Lu, my adoptive father. From now on, you will be, let's call him Lu Fugui. I was also called that back then, but it's a pity that I didn't live a day with this name." Eunuch Jia muttered to himself, saying words that the dead soldier had never heard before. After Death Soldier stood there for a moment, he bent slightly and bowed, turned around and left the woods, heading outside. His steps were as calm as when he came, but his back was obviously a little more confused. Eunuch Jia leaned under the tree trunk, watched his adopted son go away, and smiled softly. Kui Zioan, whom the boss wanted to protect, is fine. The second boss turned around, which means he has become a human. It's done. Eunuch Jia whispered softly and raised his eyes to look at the falling leaves rustling in the starry sky. I have been watching the stars in the Tai Chi Hall for a lifetime, but tonight, it seems to be the closest.